sheesh. It's not looking too good for the Zone and their next fight with Canelo Alvarez. But before we get into that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel videos. But anyway, it looks like Canelo's next opponent is going to be either Quigley or Terriano Johnson. They're both signed to Golden Boy. Both have been knocked out recently. Both are more lower tier fighters. And somebody of the likes of a Canelo Alvarez, he shouldn't be facing someone like this at all. Even the first fight on the Zone, that was already sketchy. But people said, oh, whatever. It's the first time with the Zone. It's the first time they're working together. Whatever. All right? That's what they did with that particular fight. And then it seems as if right now he's going down that same path. He was looking at Derevyanchenko. They were looking at maybe making that fight. But I think that the situation with that was they wanted him to come up in weight to 168 pounds and fight there. You know, he's a 160-pounder. He just faced Gennady Golovkin. A lot of people believe that he beat Gennady Golovkin. A lot of people don't even believe the fight was close, and they believe that he was robbed in that fight, which sucks because right now he really should be an IBF champion at 160 pounds. So a situation where they were negotiating with him, with their stipulations. I don't know what finances they were actually trying to offer him, but even with the last time, they were, looking at, him fighting him or fighting Gennady Golovkin, and he actually ended up picking Gennady Golovkin because he was going to make more money fighting Gennady Golovkin. So, again, they were negotiating, trying to get this done, and it turns out that I guess he must have a better offer or a better situation taking on Jermell Charlo. So Jermell Charlo just got that fight. It looks as if, or Jamal, whichever, the big Charlo, 160 pounds. It looks like he got it. He's getting the fight, and they're going to be getting it on. So a respectable opponent that Canelo could have fought is out of there. It's out the window. There's others he could have fought, even at 168 pounds. He could even fought Smith from the UK. But for whatever reason, those fights can't be made. So I don't know what's going on. It's kind of speechless just due to the fact that he would go so low in the totem pole as far as the fighters that, he could go against. Especially with and I don't understand how the Zone is doing it, because they've been paying him a substantial amount of money to pay somebody $32 million to fight some super low tier fighter. That to me is just crazy, especially when you yourself ain't getting no kind of upside. There's really no kind of recuperation of those funds. To me, it's absolutely mind-boggling, but that's what they choose to do. They talked about previously about him taking a significant pay cut, so maybe that's what it is. Maybe he's going to take a substantial pay cut, and face his guy, not only in just like obviously no gate and things of that nature, but maybe when it comes to his quote guaranteed purse, maybe instead of 32 million, he's only going to make 15 million for this fight. Maybe it's going to end up being something like that, but this is not the type of opponent that this man should be facing, especially somebody that's supposedly, quote, the face of boxing. And at this point, I'm not even sure you can even call him the face of boxing anymore. When Floyd Mayweather used to fight, there was no fight that was bigger than a Floyd Mayweather fight. When literally you could look all through the year after year after year after year after year after year, and no fight was on his level of his fights. Nothing competed with him. Not even Manny Pacquiao. He outperformed Manny Pacquiao on a consistent basis. He was king. Once I remember that, what was it? The UFC tried to set up a fight on the same day as him. They never did it again because he washed him. He washed him. So he was the king. But when you look at last year, let's look at last year and the fights that Canelo had last year, and then the fight as everybody else. When you look at the absolute biggest fights that generated the most, that was the most money, that was the most watched, the most talked about. You're talking, what the hell's that dude's name? You're talking about Earl Spence versus Mikey Garcia. It was a bigger fight than any fight Canelo did. You're talking about Earl Spence versus Sean Porter. Generated more and was talked about more than anything Canelo did on that particular year. You're talking Manny Pacquiao versus Adrian Broner. Generated more and did more than any of Canelo's fights. You know what I mean? You're talking about Manny Pacquiao versus Keith Thurman. You know? You're talking about Deontay Wilder versus Luis Ortiz. You're talking about Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury. These fights were all bigger than any fight that Canelo did last year. You know what I'm saying? You're talking about 6 fights that generated more finances. There was more hype, more build-up, and were more talked about than fights that Canelo did. When you have that substantial amount of fights that are bigger than the fights that you're doing, you can't talk about yourself as being the king anymore. Me personally, I don't think you can at all anymore. Man, like I said before too, Canelo don't care, and he shouldn't care. These morons are gonna pay him the amount of money that they're paying him. F that. Okay, I'm gonna fight the lowest tier fighters that I can fight. I'm gonna fight the safest fighters I can fight, especially if that money isn't necessarily guaranteed. And it looks as if that money is not necessarily guaranteed in the way that people think it is. So if I can do that, because I don't know what happens if he takes a loss. So shoot, these morons are gonna pay me that kind of money. Yeah, I'm not going to be the biggest face in boxing. I'm not going to have the biggest fights. I'm going to fight the lowest tier fighter that they will, what's going to say okay to me fighting. You know, I've said that a million times. But at the same time, you still can't consider him to be the best fighter in the world or the face of boxing when other fights are generating more and other people are doing bigger bouts. And they are. And they've talked about as an excuse as, oh, the pandemic and this and that, that's the reason that it's the way it is. And I have to say, no, that's BS. Just due to the fact that look at the UFC and all the fights that they've set up and the fights that they're trying to set up for the future. You know? So I have to call that BS. When it comes to PBC, all the fights that we're looking at being set up is Shevchenko versus Charlo. We're looking at Garcia probably versus Manny Pacquiao. We're looking at Earl Spence versus Danny Garcia. We're looking at Gervonta Tank Davis versus Leo Santa Cruz. These are the fights that they're looking at setting up. So when you look at that type of lineup that they're trying to do, you see the lineup that the UFC has been doing. That's all BS. And you're the billion-dollar company. You got the biggest budget in boxing, right? You got the biggest budget in boxing. You bowling. Everybody gonna fold, right? Can't give those excuses, you know? And especially when you're the quote face of boxing, you're supposed to be getting those big fights. You're supposed to be getting it. When you see when Floyd Mayweather said, "Yo, this is the guy I'm fighting," that's the guy he was fighting. Period. Whenever Floyd said, "This is the guy I'm fighting," that's the guy Floyd fought. All right? Period. It wasn't, people weren't saying, "Nah, I'm good. I'll take his other fight instead." People weren't saying that. He got the fights done. So, you know, if Canelo ends up doing these fights, it's not going to be a good look because it's going to push him further down. When you're talking about the kings of boxing, the faces of boxing, it's going to be pushing him down, you know? And very soon, I mean, he's getting that big guaranteed money, but very soon, some of these younger guys could not only be bigger names in boxing, but could actually be making more money as they continue to build and build and build. Because you're building yourself, you know, in networks that, you know, people can actually see you. You keep growing on to the point where all of a sudden now, you know, you're doing a pay-per-view where you're making $50, $100 million. And these guys can get there. Imagine Terrence Crawford versus Earl Spence in 2022. You know, big matches could be coming up. Big. You know, imagine, we know Wilder versus Tyson Fury too. How big that's going to be. And imagine, you know, let's say Deontay Wilder wins that, and after that we got a pay-per-view between him and Anthony Joshua or something like that pops up. You know, not even that. Him against Dillian White's going to be a big fight. Would be a big fight if it was coming off a victory like that. You know, Manny Pacquiao versus Earl Spence, if that happens. How big of a fight that's going to be. You're talking about a fight where those two can actually make more than Manny Pacquiao than Canelo Alvarez. It can start to get to that. You know, very soon in the next year or two. Even with that big guaranteed purse that he has. So not only will he not be the biggest, not have the name, but he wouldn't even have the biggest purses at that point. Not to mention what happens if the zone folds. But hey, man, shout out to Canelo. Keep doing your thing. These morons are paying you that kind of money that they're paying you, but when it comes to being the face of boxing or having fights that have significance in this sport, what he's setting up and what he's doing just ain't cutting it anymore. But it is what it is. Like, subscribe, share. I'm out.